At the same time, every single day, every single minute, there are millions of potential images that do not reach me. And in that way, what is ethical in responding to those images that I happen to see when I do not respond to all of these other potential images of distant suffering? It seems to me that this is a different situation from the one we find ourselves in any given society where we confront our immediate other.
Thank you. Well, indeed, I ended up having to rewrite this paper and taking out sections on the media because it's such a big issue. But let me just say this first, that by media, I don't necessarily mean dominant media. I don't even necessarily mean modes of presentation or communication that are called media in a conventional way. I would include anything that presents a reality to us, including absence, including breakdowns in communication or censorship, conditions of censorship. So it's not just that the graphic image calls upon us, but also the encounter with the limits of what is communicable or conveyable or presentable. That also strikes me as extremely important. So for instance, when we think about the way in which embedded reporting has worked in Afghanistan or in Iraq, we get certain kinds of photographs, but then we also are up against the limits of what appears, and we know that there is something that does not appear. And then the question is, what is our obligation toward that differential way of representing or presenting reality? In other words, we need a critical analysis of media in order to understand what obligations we actually have, since it's not just the explicit image that calls upon us. Sometimes it's the very absence of the image that calls upon us. Now, there's a second part to your question, though, which I think is very important. And you know, Jacques Derrida once said about Levinas, he said, if I have to respond to every possible face, and remember, the face for Levinas is not necessarily the literal face. It's any sign of injurability. So if I had to respond to every possible face, I would be infinitely responsible, and I would fail at my responsibility because I couldn't possibly be responsible to them all, right? He had this exasperated way of referring to Levinas's idea of responsibility. But let's say this, that rather than understand responsibility as something that is linked to this or that presentation only, if my responsibility is to an indefinite series, and let's say, I mean, when we say we're responsible for opposing genocide, we don't know each and every individual, we don't have an image, we don't have a trace of each and every, we are actually opposing an indefinite, the killing of an indefinite series of others. An indefinite series, an open-ended series, an all-inclusive, indefinite, open-ended series, if that's possible. And so what emerges from that is actually something more like a principle that is elaborated over time. So I guess I want us not to think of what impinges upon us only as a specific image, but rather as an ethical claim that has a certain kind of generalizability and that can actually be articulated in terms of more general principles. I think that that's the way around that phenomenalization of the demand. But you know, just going back to the first point briefly, if one were to really think about how the dominant media or the media that now gives us the pictorial and narrative realities of war actually operates, we would have to think about how it operates, what counts as media, differential access to media, and media's differential access to what actually happens on the ground, or certain local events that are never relayed, that are not circulable, that are not circulating. And we would have to be able to give an analysis of all of that in order to give a kind of substantive account of the problem of knowing obligation, right? The epistemological problem of even knowing what our obligation might be.
Any other questions?
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. My name is Joseph Sverker, and I wonder a little bit about grievability. If I understand you correctly, you use grievability as something that can identify what we count as human, but I wonder if is it also something that you could say works performative in your sense of the word, of creating human as well. There was in the editorial today in one of the main papers, there was this argument for lowering the weeks for allowing abortion, because she used the example or gave the example of an aborted fetus surviving for a few hours after the abortion, gasping for breath, and the nurses not being able to being in the room or remaining in the room because of their being ethically overwhelmed by this fetus, not counting as a human life. But I wonder, to me it seems that in this instance, grievability meets something that is rejected or unchosen, and does not count as a human life. But does the grievability here make it, or in some way constitute human life as well, if the question makes sense?
But I think that there are, for instance, in the situation of abortion, one could say that with abortion, you could say that the aborted fetus is grieved precisely as a life that did not live, right? Or as a life, as something that that was not able to take form or shape as an existing life. And then there's a different view that would say that the fetus is grieved or grievable because it's already a human life, right? But we can grieve that which already exists and is lost, or we can grieve that which does not have a chance to come into existence. We can even grieve that which never had a chance to come into existence, which is why sometimes women can grieve childlessness itself. So I don't think grievability works in one way, and it doesn't necessarily work to humanize. What it does is it indexes, at least in these examples, modes of attachment and possibly phantasmatic investment, and lost possibilities. But it's I think those are different issues.
With the final question regarding
Yes.
your own development as a philosopher.
Yes.
Because you started out, you might say that your claim to fame was the work you did on the philosophy of gender. And today we've heard you talking about the situation in Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. And would you say that this is development of the same thoughts applied on different fields, or could we talk about an earlier Judith Butler and a later Judith Butler?
Well, let me say this. My very first work was on the French reception of Hegel and on the phenomenology of spirit. And there I was particularly interested in the problems of desire and recognition. And I think that much of the work in feminism and queer theory that I did was also, I think, about whose desire is recognizable, how do forms of recognition sustain or fail to sustain desire. I think I then moved to some questions about when, especially during the 1990s in the United States, when so many people were dying of AIDS and there was no public mourning for those deaths, I became really concerned with the question of why it is these lives were not publicly mournable. And I became concerned with that question again after 9/11, when my beloved country mourned its own losses but refused to mourn the deaths that it was itself causing. So I thought there were real questions: whose lives and loves are mournable, whose lives and loves are recognizable. And I think that some of my work on war and my concern with cohabitation in Israel and Palestine has to do with how recognition functions to constitute who is valuable and who is grievable, and how different regimes of recognition can function differently. Arendt and Levinas are not Hegelians, and I myself have moved from the Hegelian point of view to some degree. But if I say that my life is bound with the other, and that in preserving the other's life, I preserve my own, you can find it.